Everybody stay where you are. This is one of the rare times where we have no breaks between our next panel, but we do have a quick stage setup. So here we're going to have a really important conversation that definitely has been going on a lot in our minds. So this one will be on disinformation, misinformation, and we have a really stacked panel for this. So Wasim Khaled is the CEO and co-founder of Blackbird AI, a product that detects and responds to harmful narratives that cause reputational and financial harm. We have Dr. Andrea Hickerson, director of the National Center for Narrative Intelligence at Ole Miss. We have the Honorable Ellen McCarthy, the CEO and founder of Trust in Media Cooperative, a forum focused on building a standard framework and language for trusted AI and information quality. And last but not least, expertly moderated today from Heather McMahon, a strategic advisor at Night Dragon, a firm that invests in growth and late-stage companies with the cybersecurity, safety, security, and privacy industry. So it looks like we are rapidly getting set up here, so if the panel could take to the stage, and we will kick this off. Please welcome our panelists as they get up here.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Again, I'm Heather McMahon. I'm your friendly moderator for this brave discussion that we're about to have here. And our topic is the new war, narrative attacks created by information and disinformation. And really, when you think about it, information has historically always been used as a tool of statecraft, of conflict and commerce, but it's really only been recently that it's captured so much of the public attention, as well as the attention of governments. And I think part of that is because so much of the narrative we've delivered the understanding to all of most every human brain and eyeball in the world that narrative attacks can be used by folks that don't have civil liberties or democratic values in mind. And as an artifact of this, the World Forum at Davos labeled mis and disinformation as the #1 threat to stability, to international stability, which is truly amazing. So to discuss this wonderful topic with us, again, we have these three wonderful protagonists. Wasim Khaled, who's CEO and founder of Blackbird AI. We will be very interested to hear your origin story in a few moments. We have Dr. Andrea Hickerson, director for the National Center for Narrative Intelligence at Ole Miss. And also, she's dean of the School of Journalism and New Media. So thank you, Andrea, for coming here. And last and not least, we have the Honorable Ellen McCarthy, who's the CEO and founder of Trust in Media Cooperative, and also former Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research at the State Department. So thank you for being willing to answer these questions. Let me give the audience just a preview of the roadmap we're going to use for this discussion. For the next 40 minutes, we're going to get to know each of our protagonists here and get to understand why did people with these skills and capabilities found these organizations to take a bite out of this important problem. Then we're going to hear about some of the scary problems that narrative attacks present in society today. And please bear with us, because this part, can get a little dark, but we won't leave you in that dark place, because all of these folks are help building the solutions, and we will get to the solutions. And also, there's a fourth protagonist in the room, and it's actually you, the audience. This is not another DC panel that is inflicted on you, the audience. This is a panel that is designed for you and with you. And as such, we not only have a push question that you'll be able to answer on your device right now, but we will also answer your questions during the last 10 minutes of this discussion. That is, if someone gives me the distress signal that we have 10 minutes left, and we'll move and take your questions. But let's go ahead and take a look at our questions. These panelists, we really wanted to know what you guys think. And so here's our push question. What concerns you most about narrative attacks and mis and disinformation? Is it their perceived ability to undermine democracy? So for this, think of narratives that say democracy is failing, your vote doesn't count, etc. Is it that they can distort the truth if you pick this answer? You're thinking about flat Earth, did Americans land on the moon? misinformation around health measures, etc. Is it because they can create distrust between individuals? And if you choose that answer, what you're thinking of is a domestic discord, neighbor upon neighbor, group upon group domestically. Is it that they can create distrust between citizens and their institutions? Another important concept we're going to unpack here today. Or does it primarily concern you that it could impact operations in conflict zones and our feelings about those, for example, Hamas and Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, South China Sea, and all of that. And then lastly, the last option I like, you're not afraid of narrative attacks. Narrative attacks might be afraid of you. I like to call this the Secretary Jim Mattis option, but that's an option as well. So all right, well, let's get to it. So let's turn to Wasim first. What brought you, with your incredible capabilities, into this problem set?
Quite a few reasons. I'll probably only get into the lighter ones today, but I would say that, one, being in technology, I've been in technology all my life, done multiple startups there, and I think many of us in the tech space, particularly 2015, 2016, started to question whether the things that we were doing in technology were really bringing a net positive to the world, to society, and this persists until today. So my co-founder and I actually kind of had this discussion on if we were going to spend the next 10 years working on something, what could we do that would bring some sort of net positive value to society and to, here where we live in the US, bring something good out of it. And we thought about what is the problem that really keeps us up at night. And turned out it was disinformation. At the time, people really weren't thinking about it in the way that we do today in terms of impact. But we saw good people being subverted in ways that just surprised us, and it kind of transcended ethnicity, class, religion. It didn't really matter. These campaigns were designed to change perceptions. And we realized then that what we were really looking at is a attack or a cyber attack on human perception. And so being technologists, we thought to ourselves, how do we use technology to actually detect and mitigate these kinds of problems? Is it even possible? And so we wanted to do this, and we wanted to actually reach out also to the national security community to see if we could help, because we just didn't see anything out there, which surprised us. And so, like many entrepreneurs, you look for something you want to see in the world that's not there, and kind of set out to create that. That was in 2017, and so it's a very mission-driven endeavor. And I will just also add that, my daughter was just about to be born around that time, and I thought, do I really want her to grow up in a world where no one trusts anyone and you can't trust anything you see? And of course, with each passing month, you could almost say we're heading more into that space. And so how do we build something that can defend against that outcome?
Well said, Wasim. With my old government hat on, 10 years ago, it would have been difficult for me to imagine as a government person how a technology firm could take a bite out of this problem. Now it's readily apparent, and we'll make sure that you get to unpack some of those examples here to come. But thank you. So turning to Andrea, so similar. It was difficult for a lot of folks in DC to understand how research and how academic institutions could help take a bite out of this problem, and yet here you are, you're doing it.
Yeah, thank you.
How did you get here?
It was a circuitous route to get there. So my interest has always been in political communication and transnational communities, and that's where my research was. And in graduate school, looked at Kurdish populations building identity and using new social media tools to use that. And reflecting back on that time and preparation for this, it was really coming from a place of optimism, of people being able to tell their own stories. And this was going to be this great liberating globalization place to create new narratives about things. And it didn't really work out that way. What we've seen is really kind of the reassertion of nation states in the digital space in a different way. So that's been kind of my research thing. And then the other part that kind of aligned with this too is I spent 10 years of my academic career at Rochester Institute of Technology, which has a large computing presence, and starting to get involved in kind of the digitalization of journalism routines. And I've worked collaboratively with a team of computer scientists, cybersecurity on a deepfake detection tool specifically for journalists. And so when I look at it that way, I'm really concerned about the information ecosystem and the adversarial nature that we have in that space. And I believe that is it's such an important collaborative issue for academia, for media professionals, and for opinion leaders and government officials as well.
Wonderful, yeah, and it's really great of Ole Miss to take this brave step in setting up a center around you to.
And I would say, the approach at the University of Mississippi is, it is a research center. It's brand new and it's interdisciplinary. So we are really looking to figure out what is the research in this area. It's not exclusively just an AI expertise there. We're really focused on the human in the loop process of understanding the information environment.
Absolutely, wonderful. Ellen, you could have done anything leaving the government, and yet you have attached yourself to solving the biggest problem that that governments have a hard time even addressing. You could have done anything. How did you choose this?
I served most of my career as an intelligence officer. I started in naval intelligence, would work Coast Guard intelligence, ran the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, ran operations, and left my career in government running intelligence and research at State Department. And it really struck me, Heather, after having spent a lifetime providing analysis to policymakers, warfighters, law enforcement officers, with the goal of giving them decision advantage. That didn't mean that they always listened or read or incorporated what we were providing them, but they always knew that for the most part, they always knew that when somebody came in and gave them an intelligence assessment, that it was based on solid sourcing, structured analytic techniques, third-party review. They knew what they were getting was, for the most part, reliable information. Again, that doesn't mean they used it. And it really struck me as I was leaving my career in intelligence, which was a very sad day, by the way, because I loved my jobs in the intelligence community, that who's doing that for the American people right now? That who is giving them decision advantage, or at least giving them a source that they can trust and rely on to make decisions that doesn't cost them a lot of money, or doesn't cost them a lot of time to actually go through, assess, and for the most part use to lead their daily lives. Why aren't we looking, who's the intel officer for Joe American or Josephine America? And so that's why I decided to sort of take all of the things all the lessons and tradecraft that we use in the intelligence community and see if it can be applied to the private sector with the goal of actually providing people with quality information and quality information that they believe is quality information, not because I'm telling them it's that.
Yeah, I love that example. And now we can decide, am I eating junk food or reading junk food, or am I reading
Right.
something credible and serious? So thank you for that. So now we're going to turn to the problem. So I'd like each of our panelists to share their favorite example of narrative attacks, and particularly ones that had significant impact on someone or on a society. So Wasim, we'll start with you.
Favorite narrative attack. There's hundreds of them going on at any given time, and I would probably refer to a class of them versus a very specific one. So I think when we think about what a narrative attack actually is, at least the way in which our team at Blackbird thinks about narrative attacks, it is any kind of assertion in the information ecosystem that can drive significant harm against a particular entity. And that entity could be a person, a place, a thing, a policy, a product. It doesn't really matter. What matters is it's important that people understand that narrative attacks are tradecraft. It's a growing and highly structured and disciplined tradecraft that has grown out of a number of different loosely decentralized campaigns that people have been running in the dark web, Telegram, nation-state actors, have been refining these kind of in the underbelly of the web, you could say, and it's become very powerful. And so you can use it to completely shift a person's belief system when there's any kind of critical event of note. So if the event has eyeballs, we actually call this like a super node of narrative. It could be COVID, it could be the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and that attention creates the ability to create a splintering of sub-narratives that can be utilized to create a completely different set of outcomes than what the original event was about. So for example, the conflict in Israel, Gaza, Russia, Ukraine, it can be very cleverly utilized to not only obviously fragment societies as we're seeing right now across college campuses and whatnot, it can also be used to shift, elections around what types of politicians are supporting who or when. So I would almost say the framing of victims versus aggressors in any kind of high visibility event, COVID is another one, creates that kind of splintering that we were talking about a moment ago across society or even across members of the government. And don't forget that narrative attacks, we all live in the information ecosystem. Narrative attacks will not just affect the average public, it's people in Congress, it's world leaders, it's CEOs, we're all absorbing that information every day, and it shifts strategic decision making, and it changes how we think about ourselves, right? So I would just say that all narrative attacks are designed to move people's barometer of what's right or wrong, or where they sit on a particular topic, philosophy, et cetera. And that's very dangerous because technology is being used to do this at scale. And that's what we have to remember. It's the hijacking of our existing networks and information ecosystem to actually conduct these narrative attacks. And that's why at least we believe you have to have technology that can detect when it's happening and be able to help people mitigate against them.
Yeah, absolutely. So technology was part of the problem, but also, oddly, part of the solution.
Yeah, and defense always trails offense, as in kinetic or cyber warfare and information warfare. So I think generally we all have to step up on the defense side of things right now, because otherwise, kind of everyone's sitting ducks for this kind of tradecraft. It will get much worse with generative AI, and we can talk about that in a moment. But that's driving a lot of the highlighted kind of threats that we've seen recently. Is tied to warped realities that we haven't really even yet begun to comprehend in terms of what's coming. These weapons, I would call them, are evolving fast.
Yeah, well said. We no longer need a person to argue with a person in a chat room. We can have an army of robots.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, what example would you like to share?
So I'm going to talk about kind of in the field of journalism and how they would approach this. And I think, I know they're not actually approaching it from a narrative situation. They're focused on fact-checking single claims. And that is a different approach to this, right? And there's limitations to that as well. And they're not looking to ask the question of, why is this out there? What's the point of trying to being influenced on here? So we've done some interviews with journalists on deepfake detection to figure out when they would use a tool to figure out to fact check, and that's been really interesting. So we set it up kind of like a Dungeons and Dragons experiment where we gave them fake examples and figured out how they would report that. And that was really interesting to see how they would approach that. But it was going to their sources, using their contextual knowledge, looking at those types of things. But they also want to know more than just about the detection of the fact itself. They want to know more of that organized strategic campaign, and that's much harder to study. And that's why we have the center for that. But that's much harder to get at. And so I think what concerns me about narratives is that we don't actually know where they are. We did one study looking at YouTube and videos describing how to make deep fakes to figure out who thought their audience was, and that gave some clues. There was a lot of people stalking their girlfriends. That was a big category of people on there. People positioning themselves as anarchists, right? But that's a separate stream of things. But we're not looking at it from a narrative approach. We're atomizing it at the fact level, and I think that's holding us back.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, because we can all argue about balls or strikes, but there's a whole game being played.
Yes,
and
exactly.
we need to understand all the players, the motives.
Right.
Yeah, well said. Ellen, from the Tim's perspective, what are you seeing?
Oh, not my favorite. My
Yeah,
favorite.
there we go.
So my favorite right now is the recent one we just had a few minutes ago with this whole U.S. military technology as a weapon of genocide. It just strikes me how, as the world has become so complex, people are overwhelmed with information and data. How difficult it is to sort of sift through the wheat and chaff. And so we take really complex topics like Palestine or COVID or elections, and we try to make it easy, except it's not easy because it's very complex. And so I really think that from the Tim perspective, and also we don't trust anything. So we already know that the world we live in right now, all this mis and disinformation has really, the biggest impact it's had is on our trust of anything. You know, pretty much every opinion poll known to man, which they're always different, but they agree on one thing, is that Americans' trust in any institution, to include law enforcement, schools, science, government, is at the lowest it's ever been, and it's continuing to decline. Every year we think it's going to be the worst, and it keeps getting bad. And so the impact of mis and disinformation is really on our ability to trust the institutions, and having come from one of those that really are motivated, and all of you are motivated to help people, to keep our country secure. And so, you know, I really believe that the best approach, and Tim believes the best approach, really is about bringing together the people on this stage and the people in this audience and starting to speak with a common language and establishing standards and measures that we all agree to, whether we're teaching students how to be the best journalists or we're providing technologies to identify deep fakes. But I think at the end of the day, your best offense is making sure that your consumer really understands and has the tools they need to navigate this incredibly complex environment. You know, again, on this latest Palestine issue, having just attended my daughter's graduation from UT Austin and having sat in on some of the protests down there, it really struck me how these students, they really want to understand what's going on. They really want to have this discussion. And what are we doing to give them a safe place to do that? And it's such a complex issue. They're trying to make it easier, but it's not easy, and that we really need to give them tools and give them an environment where they can learn and understand what's really going on.
Well said, well said. Well, I'd actually like to turn to one audience question now. I see a really good one up here, and it leads down the avenue that Wasim is expert in. Generative AI coupled with deepfakes presents a critical threat to advance disinformation campaigns. What tech solutions do you propose to mitigate that?
Yeah. So this is probably a bit of a perspective thing here, because I've got my own take on. Everybody is focusing on deepfakes and generative AI now, and there are technologies that we work on that can give you probability of what is likely to be a deepfake. There's a lot of solutions I see being talked about at the provider level, like the Microsofts of the world, that really aren't going to work for what we're talking about here. Okay, so that is like watermarking and embedding these patterns. You can take screenshots, you can de-res those images. Disinformation campaign actors, I want to tell you what won't work first. Okay, so what won't work is like, say, a Microsoft or an OpenAI saying we're going to watermark our media and then everything's going to be okay. So there's a bunch of models that exist in the dark web that are always going to be ungated and that are going to continue to evolve alongside the commercially viable ones. They will protect themselves from a liability and lawsuit perspective by watermarking. The disinformation campaigns will be built by the models that are in the dark web. So that's not going to solve the problem. There are ways to analyze deepfakes and generative AI that can give you probability that it is not a deepfake, but my take on it is it doesn't matter, right? Because everything is going to have some sort of generative AI filtering or layering in the very near future, whether it's your average LinkedIn post, any kind of image that's been pre-processed. So what if it's generative AI, if it's 60% or 80%? What I think is very important is, at a macro environment level, you have to understand the entire network of narratives that are spreading, who they are being targeted at to shift their perception, and the actors that are driving it, these hyper-agenda-driven groups that are creating the campaigns in the first place. Then you will understand what is the context with which this deepfake is being utilized to drive this narrative to create this outcome, and this was the intention behind it. And that's what we've spent a lot of time building our technology around, is not just let's identify a deepfake, because that's not actually tell you much, right? So it's not going to tell you why it was done or who did it or how effective it's actually being deployed to divert the narrative in the way the actors actually wanted it to go. So I often say deepfake falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it. Does it really matter? You have to understand how far it's spread and how far it's infected the public, right? So that's just our thought on it, and it's also how we've built our technology to kind of do both. The piece of media itself and then the way in which it is proliferating
Yeah.
and how much harm it might actually do to the
And
community.
context is key.
Yeah, context
Yeah.
is key.
Yep. So Ellen, on the policy side, what do you think policy-wise could be done to address a lot of this risk and challenge? Yeah.
Well, I think, so that's our challenge right now, you
Yeah.
know, is that pretty much any time we try to develop a policy or a regulation or a law, you know, it immediately gets attacked. So, I mean, I think government's role in all of this is really at an all-time low, which is where I think, you know, groups like this, private sector working together to come up with some agreements is just so critically important. You know, we've already seen Congress in its attempt to regulate AI. We've seen AI companies coming together talking about building trusted capabilities. And I think everybody, they want to do the right thing. But again, it gets to that point of, you know, do we really trust these companies are doing the right thing? And
Yeah.
so I'll say from Tim's perspective, it's can we get elements in the private sector to work together on some common standards on what good looks like? And can we establish sort of that framework and show that there's actually a consumer market for what quality information looks like? So can we arm those who want quality information? Can we get them to demand quality information?
Yeah.
Can we enhance investment in quality information? You used the example early on about you know, organic food. Can you create in the information environment what organic food was to the food market? Recognizing the government played a role in all of that, but we won't have government right now. But can we show that there's areas for investment, that there's areas where you can earn revenue? And if you can show that there's a there, then the policies will start coming. I mean, I think you look at, you know, I look at all the 18 critical infrastructures in the United States right now and sort of how they got their start. And for the most part, they were always private sector groupings, you know, coming together. The electric grid, companies coming together saying, we're going to create our own standards, we're going to adjudicate those standards, we're going to hold one another accountable to those standards. And can we do the same thing in the media environment? I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. People, industry, and organizations coming together for the common benefit. That's
With an
what
economic
it's about.
incentive to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, so the audience does want to know, what can the news media and media organizations do to address this risk, and, you know, how would you advise them?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that the journalism funding model is completely broken, and that is a public
Thank you.
policy issue. You know, there are efforts and there's proposals to put more money into local news, and that's what communities, if you look at the research, they still trust local news. People that work in local news, they're not paid very well. They don't have a lot of resources available, so I think that's one of the biggest challenges. Another point I want to make before we move on here is that we're talking about these narrative campaigns and fear, but we're really bad at measuring their effectiveness, right? And I think we can't come up with solutions or interventions until we actually start to understand where does it move a little bit. So a lot of it is still kind of in this hypothetical world. And it used to be that, you know, the discipline of communication came out of World War II and a lot of collaboration with the government and, you know, strategic campaigns. But that has fractured a little bit. But we still hear hype, and there's not a lot of research that explains big media effects. So for example, you know, in times where there's been like a tragic shooting and they, you know, people would say, oh, well, they played a lot of first-person killer video games, right? Like, there's really no evidence to support that, but that keeps coming up in the rhetoric. And so I wonder, what are we looking for? How do you measure the effectiveness? And I think those are key questions that we need to figure out before we can start figuring out some policy and some better defenses or offenses.
Yeah, and well said. All of you guys are involved with helping create these venues where people can think about it, where it can be discussed, and so that the policy folks in government can eventually, you know, make a good mark, you know, in this space. I'd like to throw up the audience poll question, if we can see the results on that, and get your all's impression of what the results are. I don't know what they are, so I think someone's throwing them up for us. Or am I supposed to do it? Here we come. All right, while we're getting the poll up, we have a few questions about AI. Can you discuss how some of the tools, Wasim, which ones you're most concerned about, which ones you think are most promising for solutions as well.
Yeah. I mean, with AI, it's kind of funny. In 2017, my co-founder and I, both of whom were computer scientists and been working on AI for some time, and we thought about, like, worst case scenario is we have like these kind of AI-driven computational propaganda machines that will like hyper accelerate the threat actors, and here we are, right? So, so I would say all of the chatter that you see around generative AI and multimodal generative AI, video, audio, text, all of that is perfectly available to every single threat actor that is in the narrative attack business and in that game. So generative AI for sure is the #1 thing that's going to drive massive scalability. Something that used to take quite a bit of tradecraft and understanding can now be tested at mass in a completely different way. So for sure, generative AI is the #1 accelerator. But I think in terms of solutions, at least we've constructed a platform that is designed and purpose-built to kind of understand narrative attacks. And so I will say it's not about what's true or false. Again, people use truth to drive narrative as well, but recontextualize it and warp it. So it is about what the most harmful narrative is to the stakeholder. And we've built a platform that looks at narratives and how far and how fast they're spreading across dark web, social news. We look at the cohort, so which hyper-agenda-driven groups are actually driving this? Are they Russian state actors? Are they PRC actors? Are they anti-vaxxers or extremists? All of those subgroups lit up in the macro environment and how fast those narratives are actually infecting the population. Then we use AI in the form of, we use generative AI ourselves here to rapidly accelerate mitigation reporting. And that's kind of how it's pieced together. Think about it as like automated fact-checking or accelerated context checking without forming a point of view, but getting you to be able to make a strategic decision faster. I think that's at least how we've approached it, and it's hard to think of another way to approach it right now, because we need things today. We don't need things a year from now or 10 years from now. These things are required right now for what's
Well, and
happening.
you're giving organizations and people their time back to not be frustrated or worried, to already know the entomology and that the attack is coming from, and just really cut down on that.
This attempted assassination on the prime minister here, that's going to be taken as, okay, the guy who didn't sign the WHO and Ukraine aid component, if you do that, you're gonna be targeted. That's going to be the narrative that's going to be driven. We're losing allies in Niger and Chad. The head of AFRICOM said disinformation campaigns are why we lost those, because the narrative was that French imperialists are the ones who are in power and have been in power for some time, and it worked in the recent elections. So you're going to see this in every election, in every topic of note, subversion of narrative, and they're working.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Let's take a little bit of attention to our poll. I see more than half the room was most worried about narrative attacks' ability to drive distrust between people and their institutions. I think that's really interesting. There were only a couple of you that were not afraid of narrative attacks at all. Dr. Andrea, can we build humans who are more resistant to these sort of attacks?
I hope so. I would agree. I would vote for the first one, create distrust between citizens and their institutions. And I think part of the problem is that we have institutions blaming each other for spreading misinformation in their own attacks, right? And so that is going to counteract anything that we're trying to do, whether it's a technical solution, an academic solution, or anything of that. But that rhetoric and those stances that people take, and traditionally journalists have positioned themselves as an adversary of the government and vice versa, and that's a stance that they take. But in cybersecurity, I'm taken with this idea of adversarial thinking, which is different, right? So you're approaching it like a hacker and thinking about how are people trying to hack what we believe about a story. And I feel like there might be some potential to start approaching stories that way collaboratively, in a way that could really build resilience. And then I'll say too is I hate media literacy efforts, I'll get that out there. I don't think that's the solution to this. What it does is it puts the emphasis back on the consumer and says, okay, you figure it out, but it's so hard and there's so many pieces of information. I don't think that's what it's gonna be. I think it's gonna be a collaborative, multi-sector effort where we reinforce each other about about what we believe is true. And I believe there are things that are true.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Ellen, what are the positive notes that you see in how we're addressing these challenges?
Well, as a follow-on to Andrea, I don't like media literacy efforts or content moderating or fact-checking. That's really, I think that there's always been distrust between citizens and our institutions. In some ways, that's our secret sauce. I mean, our snarkiness is kind of our strength. And, for me, the greatest issue is that how others are taking advantage of that. And that gets to Wasim, what you're talking about, that you've got other countries that are taking advantage of our greatest strengths, and they're sort of fueling our snarkiness. And so anything that we can do to arm people with an understanding of what is going on, I think is going to be a good thing. And I do think it's a cross-sector approach. I have to say, I don't believe that our democracy is dying. I think our democracy is being questioned, but I think democracy is always changing. And so I think that in this environment that we're in right now, it's can we all be on the same sheet of music about what does good information look like? Again, using the food analogy, I love Big Macs. I had a Big Mac 2 nights ago. I knew it was bad for me. Am I going to eat a Big Mac again? Probably not for another year. But I knew that. Can we do that in the information space? Can we provide tools where people now can go to decide if their voting booth, this voting site, is really open or not when they see a news story that says it's closed down? Can we make it easier for people in a timely manner, and not all people, because you're going to always have the super snarky. So can you get that portion of our country that actually is curious and wants to know more, and it's going to take the time, but can we give them tools and resources? And I think that, again, that gets to our best. I think that's our offense. And really, it's also highlighting how others are taking advantage of what truly is our best quality. And I don't think everybody understands that.
Yeah, well said. I love the point about snarkiness as an American strength. And I would like to get you to go back to some of my officer efficiency reports as a junior officer, and maybe those should be relitigated. But actually, like, you guys are all living examples of what's right with this country, what's right with industry, what's right with academia, and what's right with the nonprofit and government space. When people in our society apply their talents, their skills, their technical tools, their thoughtfulness, and their give-a-care about a problem, the problem is addressable, diminishable. And the other thing I like about what you guys are doing is that you're not just solving it for yourself or your own organization, but you're all building platforms that will allow more people to get in the boat, to approach this problem with curiosity, with some patience and resilience, and maybe we can move ourselves beyond calling balls and strikes or fighting about balls and strikes on an individual piece of information. We can argue about those things forever, but what we can't argue with is like where our common benefit is. And you guys are clearly operating in that space, so I commend you for that and give you each one more chance for the final parting thought. What do you want the audience to leave from this discussion with? So who wants to begin?
Well, I think I would just say, there's a saying that I really have come to love, which is, we as humans have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and that is creating a bit of a crisis today. And so it is important that people put up their shields and deploy what's required to prevent that from becoming a much worse situation than it very well could. So a room like this, and particularly the title of this entire symposium, is right in that line of thinking, so it's great to be here.
Wonderful.
I guess I would say the future is collaboration about this, is that we're past the model of a single organization getting and setting their narrative and calling their public affairs officer to stand at a podium and tell you what's going on. Nobody's winning in those situations. That's ripe for misinformation, and it's also not helping the organization that thinks they're putting everything together to begin with. And so sharing information is good and to be encouraged, and I think there's a lot of hope in sharing and collaboration.
Thank you.
Having started my nonprofit a couple of years ago, I'm struck with how many incredibly good things are going on out in the private sector right now to solve this problem. But I'm not going to say it's always been easy, because what's so frustrating is how we invest in those things. And so finding investment, is very challenging right now. Anybody who wants to invest in democracy, it's hard to explain what the return on investment is and what the sustainment model is. And so as a result, you've got all these incredible things going on, but they either don't scale, or we're competing, we're not working together. So for those of you out there who are working in the investment industry, any ideas that you can provide to help those organizations better articulate what the return on investment is, what the sustainability model is, as opposed to just saying no, that would be great. So,
Well said. I'd also, so in closing, I would like to give a shout out to a few other good organizations that have been working on this problem for a long time. One is the Information Professionals Association. Someone put a note in them about them in the chat as well. But this is an organization that's created a community for people in government and out that work on these kind of issues. So please connect with them online. And also the Center for Internet Security, which is a nonprofit that's been around for 20 years. They're home to 2 ISACs, and they do a lot of important things in the space, and particularly in helping local governments that maybe can't afford some response services actually make the internet a safer place for people to be. And thanks to all of the panelists for bravely being willing to talk about this hard topic. We do need to talk about it more in this country. We're finding good ways to do it. And so I'm optimistic about the future. And then thanks to you in the audience. Thanks for coming with us on this journey and for your wonderful questions. And please connect with our folks on LinkedIn. But look forward to talking to you guys.